had the joy, the privilege of hosting an event at WPP. Several of our agencies hosted an event to celebrate, to commemorate, to honor the Windrush generation. And I hosted something earlier in June. And we had Professor David Olusoga talking to us about really setting the scene, the historical scene, and really talking about the contributions known and unknown of, people who came to this country to rebuild it after fighting in a war, coming here, leaving what they knew, leaving the familiar, to be discriminated against, to live in some ways, to almost start over again from a socioeconomic positioning. And, those are things that we don't often bring into the workspace. And some of the feedback that we heard from that evening, we had Windrush survivors also speaking on a panel. So, it was a good group of people. And some of the feedback that we heard was, my 30 years and my 20 years of working somewhere, I've never experienced this. And what they meant was an open conversation.
I was about to say, just even the conversation.
An open conversation about, their parents' experiences or their grandparents' experiences. And then, of course, it ended with some great Caribbean food. So everyone was really happy.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the HR Leaders Podcast. On today's episode, I'm joined by Dr. Stacie Graham, who's an executive coach, founder, global director of racial equity programs at WPP, and author of the book Yoga as Resistance: Equity and Inclusion on and off the mat. During the episode, Stacie talks about WPP's commitment to invest $30 million over 3 years for inclusion and racial equity programs and to support their external organizations. She also talks about their Mindshare Impact Index, an AI human safety tool that examines the social impact of editorial content on historically underrepresented communities to make media more intentional and more equitable. As always, before we jump into the video, make sure you hit the subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and follow on your favorite podcast platform. With that being said, let's jump in. Stacie, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you. I'm well.
Nice to see you.
It's cooled down a little bit here in London. So
yeah. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Because I'm like complaining normally that I'm so hot. Like you oh, thank God. It's so hot.
You know what? After spending last week in Cannes, I'm actually quite okay with it only being 23, 24 degrees right now.
How hot was it there?
Oh, we were always very close to 30 degrees.
Oh, right.
And one day we had overcast. One day it was windy, but it was mostly just sun.
Nice. You was there for the Cannes Festival.
Yeah. So the Cannes Lions Festival of Creativity, it was the 70th edition.
Yeah.
Which was really exciting. And with the 70th edition, there were, I don't want to criticize because I really love the people who organize it. But I just felt like the panels we mostly talked about AI.
Because it's the buzzword right now.
That's the buzzword
AI,
right now.
I can imagine
AI,
AI all day. Yeah.
And the thing is, AI has been around for years. The reason we're talking about it right now is because of, Chat GPT at the end of the day, right? Which is content generation. That's one sliver of AI. AI is so much more than that. But other than that, it's always great. It's a great experience to be in a place where everyone is there at the same time, right? So you can have great meetings. You can connect with friends, peers, colleagues you haven't seen since the last Cannes. And really, I don't want to sound entitled to listeners. Obviously, it's a privilege to spend a week on the French Riviera with beautiful weather, beautiful beaches. Obviously, celebrities are there as well, eating great food. Most people drinking their rosé.
I know you're just showing off now. People listening are like, I don't know where you're listening from right now, but people are probably jealous.
Okay, I'll stop.
Yeah. Before we go and jump in more, tell everyone a little bit more about you personally.
Sure.
And your journey to where we are now.
Of course. So I'm just going to do this because I live in London and I find nowhere else in the world are people so accent obsessed. But in this,
where are you from?
Yes, it's and then I actually had someone ask me recently, "Oh, you've lived in London so long and your accent hasn't evolved?" And I was kind of like, "Oh, that's an interesting word choice, evolved." So yes, I am originally from the U.S., but I lived outside of the U.S. longer than I lived in it actually. And when I talk about home, I'm typically referring to Germany, where I lived for many years. It's where I studied. It's where I completed my doctorate. And now I've lived in London for almost a decade. London is also home, of course. And, career-wise, I always say, even though it's kind of, ooh, you shouldn't say it if you work in the ad or creative industry, but professionally, most of my career, I've worked as a management and strategy consultant. And now I have the privilege to work as WPP's global director for the racial equity program. And I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit more, but just to kind of say what it is. Obviously, we all remember what was happening in 2020, whether we want to or not. So many things were happening at once. And after George Floyd's murder, our CEO, Mark Reed, made a commitment on behalf of the entire network. So WPP is the largest advertising holding. It is a holding company that encompasses very many agencies and brands. And the commitment was, there were 3 points to that anti-racism commitment, the third being to invest $30 million over 3 years to advance racial equity. And I have the privilege of leading that $30 million commitment.
Wow. So much to unpack there. let's start with, how did you end up in Germany?
Oh, it was pure choice. I always wish to embellish the story, but there is nothing to embellish. Unfortunately, I was learning German already in the US and really desired something else. I knew I wanted to go far away from where I was. So I'm originally from the South. I love the South. But I knew I just wanted a different experience. Mm-hmm. And I chose Germany because I was learning the language and they don't charge tuition, irrespective of if you're a foreign student or a resident. So
wow.
I chose Germany and stayed.
So you studied?
I studied in Germany, yeah.
How was that experience? That must have been a bit of a culture shock from that, or maybe.
It was a culture shock, but probably, it's funny. In many ways, it makes sense that I wound up in Germany. I love a lot about kind of, if you will, the stereotypes. I love people are straightforward. There's a directness. You know where you stand. There's a structure to things. I love structure. I love order. All of those kind of stereotypical things. But also, I had a phenomenal education. I feel really lucky to have studied where I studied. I also had the privilege, because of the city that I was in, there were Americans. So it was a transition I eased into, if you will.
Okay. Because
I worked on an army post. But, I speak German fluently. In some ways, I tell people often, depending on what I'm talking about, I speak German better.
Really?
And so I loved and continue to love so much about Germany. And then at the same time, inhabiting the body that I inhabit, it was challenging. I mean, Germany does look different today, but it still has its challenges. And there are plenty of, Germany-born Black Germans who are denied their Germanness, right? And so it was a challenging experience to always be on display. And that's what I love about London. Sometimes it's maybe too much, but the anonymity that you can enjoy,
Never really thought about that.
Yeah.
Because when I grew up, the majority of my class were Black. I was one. There's 2 white kids in the class. I was one of them.
And you were one of them.
The opposite.
Right.
So when you say that my friends would say I'm from the UK, you're like, yeah, of course.
Right.
But but from your perspective, you see a Black person in Germany, oh, you're German.
Right. That's exactly the reaction. It's not possible.
That's not the reaction in the UK. So it very much,
right.
You wouldn't even think about
question
that, because
right.
London's so diverse that it's very interesting. I would never even would have thought about it from that perspective as well. So I can imagine that obviously how would you say that shaped you?
It wasn't a straight line, right? There were a lot of different phases to it. So at first there was a lot of defiance because I was coming from a place where my existence as such was not questioned. Not to claim that the US doesn't have many problems of its own, but the fact that I'm walking down the street wasn't questioned. Oh, she can't possibly be from here. And I literally was confronted in many ways on a regular basis, just like, why are you here?
Really?
Yes. And then, once it really felt like home, then I moved into a different space, depending on my capacity. I would try to engage people in conversations to help them kind of unlayer why they think a certain way or expect people to be from somewhere that they're not. And then also I feel like there are certain spots in Germany where I, found community, and that definitely helped. And then when you have that community, it feels less burdensome because, you're not carrying that weight alone.
I love that. And it feels like a lot of the choices you've made have really helped shape your journey and experience to this new role.
Yes.
And because you talk about the diversity of thought perspective, you've lived in multiple continents.
Right.
You've experienced it directly, personally.
Right.
So there's a real connection there as well. So tell everyone a little bit more about this role, Global Director, Racial Equity Program, WPP. What does that mean? What is your role?
Sure.
Maybe we should start with more about how that came to life. You mentioned it briefly,
right,
around sort of the investment. But talk more about the role and how it evolved.
Sure. I think the role has evolved with me because it didn't exist previously.
Yeah.
And when I started in lockdown, which had its pros and cons. So the pros were I got to meet with so many senior leaders in my first 2 to 3 weeks. And that would have never happened if people were allowed to travel. So I really talked to, our country manager in India, our country manager in China. I talked to people in the UK, in the US, and South Africa, really to understand, where is WPP and its entire network right now? Where do people see our strengths and where do people see things that we need to change? And what came out of that pretty quickly was, this is not about talent recruitment and retention. This is really about how can we leverage what WPP does best to positively impact wider parts of society while transforming the industry. Now that's a big ambition, obviously. And what I coined for the program is, let's be bold, audacious, and creative. And I think that's the only way that we'll get to change, right? Because if it were as easy as hiring some folks or doing some, unconscious bias trainings, it would have been done. But it's not that easy. And since I've started, what I have experienced is, one, a lot of internal support, people saying, wow, I didn't know we were doing this. I'm really proud that WPP is doing this. How can I be a part of this? And so I created a framework that is truly inclusive and transparent, and so that different people can be a part of it. And we have funded over 18 projects so far, which I'm really excited about, and they span so many different things. So just to give 2 examples, I know I'm kind of going on now, but I want people to really understand what we're doing. 2 examples, and I'll use an AI example, actually.
All right. Yeah.
In our media space, one of our agencies, Mindshare, has created a project called Impact Index. And we've started in the US, but the plan is for this to be global, where we support clients to ensure that their advertisements aren't showing up in toxic spaces online. And so we've done that with a university partner, an academic institution, to create the algorithms and use machine learning so that we can find a way that they recognize this is toxic versus, this is a statement of fact. And a lot of people, when I give that example, they think, oh, does that not already exist? But it actually doesn't.
What would be an example of it turning up in a toxic environment?
I don't want to name anything, but, let's say you're...
Are you referring to like certain threads on certain social media platforms? Like, what do you mean by that?
Sure. So if you are, I can use Tyson Foods because that is a named client that we've worked with already. If you're Tyson Foods, you want people to know that your brand is really welcoming to everyone. So you wouldn't want to show up, let's say, on a populist site that incites violence against certain populations, right? And
I get it.
do you see where it's going?
Fully get it now. You don't even need to explain anymore. I get it. So I'm like many others that you just mentioned. I thought that was already existed, that you could measure
to an extent. But today things are very fast moving.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And we don't always know when we go to a site. We don't always recognize. So maybe it's not even a site. Maybe it's a story that has appeared somewhere, and the story has taken a turn that is unexpected. This algorithm will recognize that and prevent the harm that would be caused to our brands that we support.
Incredible. So you're going to roll that across all of the business.
That is the plan. Yes. Once we're really certain that it works.
Mm-hmm. And then that's something you're working with. You say Mindshare.
Yes.
Mindshare. Amazing. Yeah. Is that something traditionally that when you told me about your role, that wouldn't have been something that would have come to mind?
Probably not. Yeah.
In a good way.
In a good way. Exactly. yeah.
I mean,
that's again, right? Think big. Like, how can we do more than just impact, within our own four walls?
Mm-hmm. What are some of the other examples? You mentioned another one.
Let me think. So there's a great one from here in the UK. I'll use an example. Something called the Consumer Equality Equation Report, which was a joint project between Ogilvy, Group M, and WPP. And it's actually the first report of its kind. So it's defined 6 ethnicity groups, including white British, to really explore what is the consumer experience across ethnicities. And to my surprise, again, it's never been done in the UK. So in other countries, it has been done, very few actually. But you can't take, let's say, data that you have on the US and just transfer it over, right?
Not, yeah.
And so what we looked at first was different sectors. So what is the consumer experience across luxury, fashion, and so forth? And then we also looked at particular brands, and we created a model that hadn't been created before to show what the disposable income over time will be for minority ethnic populations.
Okay.
And that is, of course, huge, because I think a lot of people, including, those populations themselves, underestimate the power that they hold, and the income that they have, and the choices that they have. You don't have to shop somewhere where they follow you around the store because they think you shouldn't be there, right? But we also learned that, for example,
I had an experience like that the other day, by the way.
Did you really?
My wife's black,
Okay.
and we was in. I'm not going to mention the shop because I feel like I don't want to put anyone on blast. But we were buying quite a few things, and the woman behind the till, she was scanning.
Sure.
And she said to my wife, she didn't see. Not that it matters if I was standing next to my wife, but she didn't see me observing from a couple of meters away with my daughter. And she said to Natasha, "Are you aware how much this costs?"
Yeah.
And I was just like, man.
Yeah. Classic though. Classic example.
Like, you see a young black woman and you're in a quite high end shop, and that's so disrespectful. Tasha didn't even really take it personally. She just kind of brushed off.
Right.
But I was more offended by it. I was like, because I've never had that question personally.
Okay.
So
interesting.
When I was younger, there was one experience when I was younger when I went into a motorbike dealership and I was wearing a tracksuit. And I have my accent from East London.
Right.
And I went to buy the motorbike, and they said, so you need finance.
Uh-huh.
And I was
another assumption.
Yeah, and I was like, what? At that time, I was doing very, very well in business. So I was like, no, I want to buy it.
Right.
And then he was like, oh, but you need a plan. I was like, no. And I was like, bring me someone else.
Yeah.
Anyway, so
exactly.
So it's interesting. So what was the main takeaway from the report?
Well, there are a few. First of all, what I will say is, and this is why it was important that all ethnicities were included, right?
Mm-hmm.
That both white British and minority ethnic British folks think that racism is a problem that needs to be addressed. There was an insignificant difference between those two groups. I think also that what people need to understand is 2 things. By 2061, there will be an accumulated 16 trillion pounds of disposable income in this block, if you will, of the population that is, to my knowledge, still quite underestimated in its buying power. And then also, a brand, by just changing, 1% of its behavior, that can already have an effect in the billions. And so it's not that I'm trying to sell that you should do it simply because of the commercial potential, but we just have to be honest. Businesses are here to make money, to make profit. And there will always be people who are not really interested in it for moral or, ethical reasons. They need the commercial part of it. And this report really highlights where brands can do better.
Yeah. And what were some of the other examples? So, like, follow around the store. What are some of the examples where they can do better?
Oh, easy example, which I think we in London especially will all know. When you go into a grocery store and anything that isn't like pasta or tomato paste is in like the world foods or international section.
Okay, I didn't think about
that
that one.
Came up in our focus groups that is another form of othering.
Yeah, why can't they just be next to?
Yeah,
it's true. Like if you go in, I'm just gonna say, you go in any store, Tesco, as the, if I go to my Tesco next to me, you're right, you got the aisle, and there's certain things that I love in those aisles, which I'll go and grab. But why aren't they just next to the other milkshakes? Why aren't they next to the other pasta? Why aren't the other next sauces?
Right.
Why are they just not next to every other sauce? Why does it have to have its own aisle?
Exactly.
Never really thought about that one.
Yeah, that stands out for me because I live in a borough that's 30+% Bangladeshi, and it's very interesting from corner store to corner store. It's different, but
it has its own culture, right?
Its own culture,
and it's like specific. You may have a Polish specific shop, Bangladesh shop, and we're used to that growing up, that you have your own shops.
You have your own shops, but when you go to I'm not going to name brands, I don't want to get in trouble. But if I go to the one that's closest to me, it is of course a smaller one. It's not labeled in that way because everyone who lives around me is looking for those, we want our pickle or whatever it is. But the larger one, just a mile down the road, it goes back to, world foods or international section or whatever it's called.
Yeah. What does your day-to-day look like, just out of curiosity?
Every day is different.
Yeah.
To be really honest, so I wake up, I'm a yoga practitioner, so there's going to be some breath and movement. Then, I'm an email checker, so I like to get through my emails first.
Yeah.
And it's funny because I feel like I'm most creative in the morning. So before lunch is like my peak creative time. But I love to just take 30 minutes or however long, and I'm a zero inboxer. So I get through my emails, and then I feel like this freedom to do creative things. Of course, with my role at WPP, I am in conversation all the time. So for example, with those 18 projects, that means I have 18 project owners, and I meet with them every 2 to 4 weeks.
And those are country managers or direct reports? Like, how does that work?
So it depends on the project. So any project will have come through an agency, and the project owners are, people who submitted the proposal. So in some cases, they are very senior people who are involved, and in some cases, they may be kind of middle managers. And we meet every 2 to 4 weeks so that I'm up to date on how things are going. I can act as a subject matter expert, a sounding board, also a connector, because I'll get the question, has any other project experienced this challenge? So I do have a lot of meetings, but I try to, one thing that the people who schedule my diary know is I cook for myself every day. And so especially if I'm working from home. So if I'm working from home, there has to be an hour in my diary where I can cook.
Non-negotiable.
Non-negotiable. I'm very boundary in that way. And then, I have some other things that I do, and I tend to do those more in the evening. So I run retreats, holistic wellness retreats for Black women and women of color. And so a lot of the time I'm very bad with social media. I have to admit, I really don't like it.
In terms of having to,
in terms of having to post all the time.
That kind of links back though quickly. I want to mention to our original point about the experience, because I remember I listened to a podcast with you where you spoke about the reason that you started the yoga is that when you went to those retreats or those classes, you're one of or if the only Black woman or even person there, right?
Yes.
So and was that the inspiration, I'm assuming, behind creating?
Yeah, that is, yes. Thank you. So I founded Oya Body, Mind, Spirit Retreats in 2016. And it was really, when I went to India the first time in 2012, I had been practicing yoga at that point for about 5 years. And it wasn't until I went to India that I learned anything about the fact that this is where the practice is from. It's actually not just a physical practice, it's a wisdom and faith tradition, and so on and so forth. And so that changed my perspective completely. And after I went back to India to train as a teacher, then I really started paying attention. It didn't matter if it was a mindfulness or a meditation or a silent retreat, whatever I was doing, I was almost always the only one. And it didn't matter what country. So if someone's saying, well, you did say you lived in Germany, it didn't matter if it was Germany. Here in the UK, I've had that experience as well. And there's so much that you have to hold when you are the only anything in a space. And I think anyone has had that experience. Maybe if you've been the only man in a space or the only, neurodivergent person in a space, right? There's so much you feel like you have to hold that you can't fully let go. And in a space like a retreat, that is exactly what you're being asked to do,
the whole point you're
right?
there. Yeah.
And so I made the decision to start those retreats. They've been going all of those years. And what's beautiful about it is we've created community in different places. So I've held retreats outside of Johannesburg. I've held retreats outside of Amsterdam. And it's, the feedback that we get is this. I didn't know. Sometimes I was afraid to come. I didn't know what was going to happen. And then when I got here, I knew exactly what I needed, or it was exactly what I needed and I didn't know what I needed, or I've never felt so seen, right? And so it keeps us going. I've had the opportunity to work with amazing people. I don't run them by myself. I have a faculty of wonderful people I work with. And then, most importantly, that coming back to my path, an unexpected thing that happened in 2020 was, do you remember when those black squares went up on Instagram?
Oh, yes, I do.
And actually, that was a huge mistake. Most people didn't know why they were posting black squares. But anyway, that's beside the point. But a lot of people were trying to do it out of solidarity. And a lot of communities were like, you know what? We're not going to let you do that. We've tried raising these issues for so long and you've not listened to us. Mm-hmm. And I don't know why I was surprised, but to my surprise, so many of the Oya community members were like, you have to go work with her. I was like, oh, I didn't even know you knew I was a consultant. And so I wound up working with so many yoga brands, yoga studios, teacher training schools who were really at the beginning of their journeys. And that's how I wound up writing my book, because at some point I just recognized I'm actually saying the same thing over and over and over again. You need to
scale it. You can't be everywhere all the time.
And so I want to offer people the opportunity to have at least some of the learning.
And the book is Yoga Resistance.
Yoga as Resistance, Equity and Inclusion on and off the mat. And I'm really excited. It came out last year and the audio version is coming out in a couple of weeks. You can pre-order from today, the day we're recording. But I think you can actually buy it on July 11th, if I'm not mistaken, which was also really important to me because I can't write a book about equity and inclusion and not have a version that's accessible to a larger audience, right?
So it's not just aimed at yoga.
It's very specific to yoga. And at the same time, what I tell people is there's a section on brands, and that section is for any brand. Mm-hmm. What I put in the section on how to skillfully navigate, a crisis moment, any brand can read that.
Those principles are transferable regardless of industry, of company.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Love that. And so again, it feels like all of these pieces come together for you.
Yes.
And this is all before this role.
Yes.
See, so I think no one's is listening is surprised that you landed. And because when I looked at your sort of, I was stalking you a little bit on LinkedIn, I was like, I saw your journey and experience, and I was like, oh, wow, how did this WPP role come out of nowhere? And what made you apply for this? You're doing all these great things. You got the business you're running, you got the consulting, you got the book. Mm-hmm. Why then commit to one organization?
For me personally, I was at a point where I didn't feel like I was going to grow from the consulting work I was getting. I felt like I was doing same things over and over, which is important. But I'm a person who likes to be challenged. And I just felt, for me personally, I want to grow. After giving it a lot of thought, I was like, I think the growth will happen going into a larger organization. WPP is very large. We have something like 115,000 employees across the world. It's very matrixed. There's a lot to navigate. So I've definitely had that stretch opportunity. And then on the other part of it was there were two things. One, the specificity of the role title. It was racial equity, and I always tell people I work with racial and intersectional equity. And so what does that mean? That means that it's a race first positioning of intersectional equity, because I think if we look at most conversations around diversity pre 2020, it was really gender diversity. And if we get down to it, it was mostly white women at the end of the day, because people weren't taking into consideration that Black women and women of color have different challenges. And so a lot of the things that were being addressed in tech, for example, or in STEM, they weren't going to really meet the needs of women of color and Black women. They were really just about gender diversity, which was about white women. And so I really had great respect for the opportunity to have racial equity in my title. And then again, it was in the job profile about the 30 million. And I was like, okay, so there's an actual budget involved here. Let's go for it.
Love it. And to your point, you're doing it on scale, right? In a large organization, which is touching hundreds of thousands of employees internally, but millions of customers, tens of millions of customers that they reach, and all of the brands that you work with. So there's a real this sort of ripple effect of the what you're doing out.
That's the opportunity.
Your internally, your clients, and then their clients, and then
exactly.
So it's a huge kind of net that you're casting. What does your relationship look like with the HR team, the DEI team? Because when we spoke, you pulled me up and you was like, no, not DEI, Chris.
Yeah.
This is what I specifically do. And I was like, oh, okay. So what does that look like?
Sure. So we have a chief talent and inclusion officer at WPP. She joined last year. And I think I've heard her describe it. I hope I'm getting it right. I'm paraphrasing. She would describe her role as focused on the employee life cycle. So, very much internally focused on ensuring that the employee life cycle is a positive experience for any employee, irrespective of background and, all the different social identity categories. And so that's obviously really fundamental, because we can't, as WPP, go and, create these amazing projects and not be tending to our own house, right? So that, I think, is the key part, that it makes the work that I do more authentic, because we're also addressing internal issues.
Yeah. And so, but who do you report into?
So that's a bit of a complicated one. I originally reported into our head of corporate affairs. And now there's been this transition where I do report into the chief talent and inclusion officer.
Yeah. Well, it makes sense in terms of the way, like you just described, you're doing a lot of this internally. You're kind of sharing it externally with your customers and the communities that you serve.
Right.
So it's going to be a close relationship.
Of course, yeah.
And I'm sure it's somewhat similar with HR in that sense.
Right. Though I am a bit critical. I have to be true to who I am, because if I didn't say it, people would be like, Stacie. I do find it not the most strategic placement if you're if it's whatever you call them, it might be CDO, Chief Diversity Officer, or Chief Talent Inclusion, whatever. If that person reports into the Chief People Officer,
I agree.
I don't think that's the best way to do it. And
I agree.
There are two kind of there are many reasons, but I think two fundamental reasons are: one, when we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we have to think, again, as I said earlier, we have to think about that from a strategic point of view, and it has to be integrated across the organization. And it has to also mean business transformation, not just talent, right? Talent focused. And I think that person needs to be reporting into either a CEO or a COO.
Yeah.
That's how I see it. Also, though, to build trust internally for people who have previously experienced or felt discriminated against, does it really make sense for the person who's meant to address that, change that, to support into, if you will, the institution that has been responsible for it thus far?
Yeah. No, because some people kind of end up seeing it as, it's just another HR initiative.
Exactly.
Instead of really the business is committed, they've invested, it's so serious that now that function reports directly to the CEO in many cases, in many companies. So I agree with you from that perspective. What's the legacy you want to leave behind?
Big question. I was just asked this in Cannes, and I had a big answer for it. And it was completely spontaneous. So today it's not as spontaneous, but that resonated when I said it last week when I was asked the same question. For me, the legacy is broadly that I want to leave this industry, leave this world, definitely in a better place for people who look like me. And what does that mean? That means that we have the choice, the ability to be mediocre, and we have the opportunity to do great things. And it's a real choice, right? And in doing that work, I'm hoping through my holistic wellness practices that I'm also healing intergenerational and ancestral traumas that we don't often talk about in a corporate space or a workspace, but absolutely affect how each of us are showing up, right? There are many conversations that feel really uncomfortable for people, and that's because we've been unwilling to talk about the histories that we all come from. But, we celebrated Windrush Day last week, and I had the joy, the privilege of hosting an event at WPP. Several of our agencies hosted an event to celebrate, to commemorate, to honor the Windrush generation. And I hosted something earlier in June. And we had Professor David Olusoga talking to us about really setting the scene, the historical scene, and really talking about the contributions known and unknown of, people who came to this country to rebuild it after fighting in a war, coming here, leaving what they knew, leaving the familiar, to be discriminated against, to live in some ways, to almost start over again from a socioeconomic positioning. And, those are things that we don't often bring into the workspace. And some of the feedback that we heard from that evening, we had Windrush survivors also speaking on a panel. So, it was a good group of people. And some of the feedback that we heard was, my 30 years and my 20 years of working somewhere, I've never experienced this. And what they meant was an open conversation. I
was about to say, just even a conversation.
An open conversation about, their parents' experiences or their grandparents' experiences. And then, of course, it ended with some great Caribbean food. So everyone was really happy.
It's interesting because before I got with Natasha, I had no idea about any of that stuff.
Right.
As a white male, and speaking to Tasha's parents and grandparents, that's come up in conversations. And when I first heard Windrush, I was like, "What is that? What's that?"
Oh, right. Okay.
I had no idea, and I realized neither did many of my other white male or female white friends to do that. So I was like, "Wow! Why am I only learning about this at 25 years old?"
Right.
This wasn't something we spoke about in school or in as well. And I was like, "Wow! I never even saw that." So it's important to have those conversations.
Absolutely.
I think a lot of people still probably are listening right now and have no idea what
I'm talking about.
What you're talking about. I think that's the case.
Yeah.
As well. So for that person to say, "Hey, this is the first time we've had a conversation in 20 years to address this," and I can't even imagine how that must feel to be like, "Oh, now we're having this conversation."
Right.
In a good way, though. At least
in a good way. Yeah.
We're starting it.
Yeah.
As well. What advice? Many companies don't have a specific person like yourself dedicated to this role. It's kind of just
attached on, yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
What advice would you give to those other leaders that are listening?
Yeah, I think it's similar to, what we hear when it's a panel about gender diversity and it's women on the panel and it's women in the crowd. We need everyone in this conversation. And I think most people avoid the conversation because they want to avoid the discomfort of it, but also the potential of getting something wrong, right? Everyone tries to talk about cancel culture today, even though I would say cancel culture is very short-lived. Most social media is very forgetful or forgiving. But I think, as leaders, I always say that one of the most underestimated competencies is conflict management. Conflict is seen as, something bad, fundamentally something bad, and something to avoid. But, it's really a negotiation. Just like when many of us are trying to get on the tube during rush hour, that's also conflict, right? But we willingly or unwillingly negotiate those terms every morning when we ride into work. And similarly, as a leader, no one expects you to know everything. No one expects you to be an expert across everything. But there is an expectation that you remain open to new things. You remain open to learning. You're able to listen to differences of opinion, and you're able to hold that space for, your team. And so what I would really encourage all leaders to think about is, what role are you playing in creating a space where that's possible, right? Where people can have these types of conversations as a starting point, and then you as a leader taking the conversation forward and bringing something into action.
Yeah.
But in order to do that, you have to allow yourself to be vulnerable and to say, I didn't know about Windrush, or I didn't know that much about Windrush, or I didn't recognize that being one of two in my team presents challenges,
Yeah.
But that's a skill that we should really demand of all leaders.
It's as you said, it is scary. You are going to make mistakes.
Yeah.
And Shane and I, my co-founder, we always talk about when we have those conversations, it's when the magic happens.
Yes.
And the people are like, what do you mean? I'm like, at the time it's scary. You make mistakes. You think, oh, am I going to say something wrong and be cancelled?
Right.
All of those things, and companies are so scared now. They say nothing at all, and that's the worst thing you can do.
That's the worst thing.
And I've spoken about this many times before, where my wife's called me out in the past and said, I'm really disappointed that you didn't save that,
right.
or you shared it with me at home, but why are you not sharing it on social media? Because I'm worried about saying the wrong thing, right? But it's good that I have an accountability partner, someone that can call me out. Or with Shane recently, he won't mind me saying this, we kind of built a few events, and I was like, this is not diverse. This is not diverse enough. This doesn't represent our community. We can't have a panel of all white males, right?
Right.
Or it doesn't even matter in either way. We've even had comments you wouldn't believe in the past where it's like, why is it all black people on the panel? Why do we not have anyone white talking about D&I? Which is also a fair point.
Very important.
Very fair point too, right? Because then they're feeling excluded. So it is scary. You're not going to get it right every time, but it's important to start that conversation.
What I would build on that is, from my point of view, it's not so much about white people feeling excluded. It's about white people, or whatever majority we're talking about, depending on the space, understanding that they have a role to play. So it's not on people who experience racism every day to solve racism, right? It's not on people who experience sexism every day to solve sexism. So we need everyone in the conversation, genuinely and sincerely in the conversation. Also, because yes, surely I, inhabiting the body I inhabit, have no clue what it's like to go through the world as you do, right? And so I can learn from that as well. Maybe the learning is that I should be bolder when I walk into spaces, or maybe the learning is, oh, not everyone feels as confident as I assume just because they're a white man. Whatever it is, we need everyone at the table.
Yeah. Well, listen, I think I can talk to you forever. Want to get you your own show as well. Before I let you go, where can people reach you if they want to reach out, say hi, connect, grab a copy of the book? Where's the best places for people to go?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's easiest through my retreats. And you can find the retreats on Twitter, on Instagram at Oya Retreats. So that's just OYA Retreats, plural, with an S on the end. And on LinkedIn, I have learned that I'm kind of hard to find, which a little bit, because I try to be a differentiator because my name is so common, even though I spell it with an IE, Stacie spelled with an IE. So if you want to find me on LinkedIn, please do connect. It's Dr. Stacie CC Graham.
Love it. Well, as always, everyone, those links will all be below. So you have to go search anywhere. So wherever you're listening or watching right now, the links will all be in the description Honestly, I really appreciate you coming in. I love what you're doing. I love your energy.
Thank
I love your
you.
story as well, right? You know, one of the reasons I love doing this show and starting with your journey is it really shapes everything and to where you
Absolutely.
are right now and the
Yeah.
impact that you have. And clearly your values and mission and purpose are aligned right now. So I wish you all the best until next week.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's been great.